This is a story you will not soon forget, especially if you work as a waitress. This is the story of Joe Ball. You see, Joe was not your average businessman, as you will soon find out. Joe ran a small bar outside of Elmsdorf, Texas, located off of Highway 181. The name of Joe's bar was The Sociable Inn. Joe's Inn became well known and liked around the area once he began raising alligators, to which he liked feeding live cats and dogs, in a concrete pool he built behind the bar. The tavern was also popular because there were new barmaids and waitresses coming and going all the time. Joe's wives also seemed to disappear on a quite regular basis. However, one thing that Joe never fell short on was fresh meat for the alligators, and possibly the customers. Joe was very protective of his beloved gators. At one particular point in time, when a neighbor complained about the smell of rotting meat, Joe pulled out a gun on the guy and in a not-so-nice way explained that it must have been the alligator's food, and that the nosy neighbor should mind his own business in the future if he did not want to become part of that food. Another one of Joe's neighbors was so afraid of Joe that he moved to another city just to get the hell away from him. Joe's business seemed to be doing well, despite the fact that his help seemed to keep disappearing. Hard to find good help, you know. That is, until around the year 1937, when the family of one of Joe's former waitresses, 22-year-old Minnie Gotthard, began to ask questions, specifically of the police. Since Joe had employed Miss Gotthard, the police questioned him. Nonetheless, they were unable to find any substantial evidence, and Joe seemed like such a nice guy. Hence, he was cleared of all involvement and dismissed as a possible suspect. A short time after Ms. Gotthard's disappearance, another family went to the police about their missing daughter, Julia Turner. Ms. Turner had also worked part-time for Joe Ball. Police again visited the inn, and Joe gave them the same old song and dance as he had the previous time. He claimed that she had told him she was having some problems, and wanted to move on and start again. When the police searched Julia's room, she shared with a friend they discovered she had not packed any of her clothing or belongings. Upon discovering this tidbit of information, they went back to Joe's for another round of questioning. This time, Joe suddenly and conveniently remembered that he had lent her $500 because she was in such a desperate state, and could not go back to her home due to problems with her roommate. Joe Ball was again in the clear. Unfortunately, Joe could not seem to control himself. In the following months, 2 more of his employees came up missing. This time the local police turned the case over to the Texas Rangers. Upon receiving all of the information from the local police, they checked into Joe's background, including among other things, his previous employees. They then discovered that an alarming number of them, a few dozen, had vanished. More incredible was the fact that no one had seen either his second or third wives, since they supposedly ran out on him. The Texas Rangers questioned Joe relentlessly for hours on end. Nonetheless, he would not crack. Hence, they had no choice but to release him. Unfortunately, though, for poor old Joe, he left a few strings untied. His handyman William Sneed came forward and revealed to police the times he was forced by Joe at gunpoint to feed pieces of female corpses to Joe's alligators. In addition, his old neighbor came forward and told why he had run off. He said he had witnessed Joe cut the meat off of a human body and feed the pieces to the alligators. The police just about had all of the evidence that they needed. On September 24, 1938, police paid one last visit to the Sociable Inn to take a gander into Joe's meat barrels. Realizing that this was it, Joe pressed the "No Sale" button on his cash register. When the drawer popped open, he reached in and grabbed his revolver and shot himself. Some claim he shot himself in the chest, some say he shot himself in the head. No matter, it was in fact a fatal shot. In the aftermath, Joe's handyman William Sneed, despite admitting to authorities that he had helped Joe dispose of the waitresses' bodies, only spent 2 years in prison. Joe's alligators were sent off to the San Antonio Zoo for the public to enjoy, and Joe's third wife resurfaced. She claimed to know about her predecessor's fates and explained that she did not want to end up the same way. Hence, she ran off and hid. She was never charged with any crime. Just how many women Joe Ball turned into alligator food is unknown. This is a secret he took with him to his grave, and we will never be certain of the exact number. Sentenced to imprisonment at hard labor for life, Henry Layer, self-confessed slayer of 8 persons at Turtle Lake, April 22, started serving his prison term at 4 o'clock this afternoon, less than 48 hours after he was arrested. Layer was brought from Washburn, where he pleaded guilty before Judge Newsell in District Court, to Bismarck by automobile and committed to the state penitentiary here. At no time during the brief trial or the trip to Bismarck did the slayer express the slightest concern over the 8 persons he murdered exactly 3 weeks ago. Given every opportunity to change his plea or repudiate his confession, and warned by Judge Newsell of the seriousness of the charge to which he confessed and later plead guilty, Layer stoically refused the services of a lawyer and only asked that let it be over with as fast as possible. Ill feeling over a long-standing incident. Injuries administered to Layer's cows by Wolf's dog culminated in a quarrel. Layer went to Wolf's farm home shortly before noon, and heated words, followed by Wolf's demand that Layer leave the place immediately, were the events leading up to the murder of the 8 people, according to Layer's confession to the authorities. When Layer refused to leave the place, Wolf went into the sitting room, got his double-barreled shotgun, and loaded 2 shells into the breech. Layer grasped the gun and attempted to wrest it away from Wolf. The struggle took place in the entrance to the kitchen, during which the gun was discharged twice. Layer claims in his confession that one of these shots killed Mrs. Wolf, and the other the 13-year-old chore boy. By this time Layer had succeeded in wresting the gun away from Wolf. The murderer darted into the sitting room, got a handful of shells from the bureau and hurried back to the kitchen entrance. Wolf was running towards the barn and Layer fired the shot, striking Wolf in the back. Wolf fell to the ground and Layer ran up to him and placed the muzzle of the gun against the wounded man's side and fired again, tearing a huge hole in Wolf's body. 2 of the smaller daughters, frightened at the fighting and seeing their mother and the boy fall dead in the kitchen, ran into the adjoining bedroom and escaped from the house, running to the nearby cowshed. Arrested by the screams of 2 girls, Layer rushed into the barn, firing 1 shot which cut a furrow in one of the girls' head. The shot splintered the wall. Layer jammed the muzzle of the shotgun against the head of the other girl, who also was screaming and pleading for mercy, and pressed the trigger. He then placed another shell into the gun, put the muzzle against the head of the first child shot, who was now dead, and fired again. The 3 little girls in the house were screaming. Layer returned to the kitchen and deliberately killed the children, 2 of them with the shotgun, placing the muzzle against the curly heads and the third with a smashing blow of a hatchet. After 7 members of the family and the chore boy had been killed, Layer went to the cowshed, covered up 2 bodies of the girls with hay, dragged Wolf's body into the cowshed and covered it with hay. He then went to the kitchen, opened the trapdoor leading into the cellar, and dumped the 5 bodies into the basement. Taking the gun which he broke in order to better conceal it, he went to a nearby slough, threw part of the gun and some shells into the water, and by a circular route returned to his home. He did not say anything to his wife and 5 young children. While at the slough he washed his hands and removed all traces of blood from his clothing. The solution of the mystery, which had been baffling the authorities, handicapped as they were because no clue had been left by the murderer and 2 days had elapsed between the time the murders were committed and the bodies were found. Obtaining a number of depositions from people living in the neighborhood of the Wolf farm, the authorities tightened the noose around the suspected man. Finally, sufficient circumstantial evidence had been obtained to indicate that Layer had committed the crime. Chief Martinson was the first to suspect the guilty man, who was finally arrested Tuesday, and by more than 8 hours of continuous examination, forced the confession from his lips. The strain proved too great for the murderer, and after several hours of this mental torture, Layer broke down and said he was the murderer. The confession, according to the police, was wormed out of him piece by piece until the entire story had been told. Less than 5 years later, Layer died following an operation for appendicitis. By all rights, Harvey Carignan should never have become a serial killer. Sentenced in Alaska to be hanged for murdering a woman in 1949, the hulking killer might have been eliminated early on had not the system intervened. An overzealous sheriff had elicited confessions from the suspect with assurances that Carignan would not be executed, a condition that appeals courts found disturbing. Carrigan's death sentence was reversed in 1951, and after serving 9 more years on a conviction for attempted rape, he was paroled in 1960. There would be more arrests for burglary, assault, and other crimes. In 1965, Carignan was sentenced to a term of 15 years in Washington, but with time off for good behavior, he would hit the streets again in 1969, consumed with an abiding rage against society in general and women in particular. Harvey married a Seattle widow shortly after his parole, but their relationship was doomed from the beginning. Sullen, uncommunicative, Carignan would frequently get up at night and drive long distances to be alone and think. When he refused to share his thoughts or name his destinations on the long nocturnal drives, the marriage fell apart. Remarrying another widow in 1972, Carignan showed no improvement. His lascivious attentions to a teenaged stepdaughter finally forced the girl to run away from home, and he was faced with yet another failing marriage in the spring of 1973. That May, young Kathy Miller answered Harvey's advertisement for employees at a service station that he leased. The girl was missing for a month before 2 boys discovered her remains while hiking on an Indian reservation north of Everett, Washington. Nude and bundled in a sheet of plastic, Kathy had been bludgeoned with a hammer, knocking holes the size of nickels in her skull. Detectives in Seattle were aware of Harvey's record, and they hounded him with such intensity that he departed from their city shortly after Kathy Miller's body was retrieved. A speeding ticket from Solano County, California, on June 20 placed Carignan in the vicinity where half a dozen women had been murdered in the past 2 years, but there was nothing solid to connect him with the crimes, and he was on his way cross-country, seeking sanctuary in his old, familiar haunts of Minneapolis. On June 28, Marlis Townsend was assaulted at a bus stop in that city, clubbed unconscious from behind. She woke in Harvey's car, still groggy from the blow, but when he tried to make her masturbate him, she found strength enough to save herself by leaping from the speeding vehicle. Police made no connection with the human time bomb ticking in their midst. September 9, Jury Billings, age 13, was hitching rides in Minneapolis to reach her boyfriend's house, when Carignan pulled up and offered her a ride.
On September 8, 1974, he picked up Lisa King and June Lynch, both 16, while they were hitching rides in Minneapolis. He offered money if the girls would help him fetch another car that had been stranded in a rural area. Once out of town, however, Harvey stopped the car and started beating June about the head and face. When Lisa ran for help, he sped away and left his latest victim bleeding on the roadside. A month before, on August 10, another romance had collapsed for Harvey. Eileen Hunley was a woman of the church, who looked for good in others. She had informed her friends of her intent to terminate the sour relationship, but Eileen Hunley disappeared on August 10. When she was found in Sherburne County 5 weeks later, she would be a rotting corpse, her skull imploded by the force of savage hammer blows. On September 18, the day Eileen Hunley's body was recovered, Harvey picked up Sally Versoy and Diane Flynn. He used the old ruse about fetching a car, then began to make lewd propositions, assaulting both girls when they failed to respond on command. They escaped when he ran short of fuel and was forced to stop at a rural service station. 2 days later, 18-year-old Kathy Schultz did not return on schedule from her college classes, and a missing persons bulletin was issued by police. Her corpse was found next day, by hunters, in a cornfield 40 miles from Minneapolis. As in the other cases, Kathy's skull had been destroyed by crushing hammer blows. Police in Minneapolis were talking to their counterparts in Washington by now, and within days, survivors started picking Harvey out of lineups as the man who had abducted and assaulted them throughout the past 2 years. A search of his possessions turned up maps with some 181 red circles drawn in isolated areas of the United States and Canada. Some of the circles yielded nothing, indicating points where Harvey had applied for jobs or purchased vehicles, but others seemed to link him with a string of unsolved homicides and other crimes involving women. One such cryptic circle marked the point where Laura Brock had disappeared, near Coopeville, Washington. Another, at Medora, North Dakota, coincided with discovery of a murdered girl in April 1973. Yet another had been drawn around the very intersection in Vancouver where a woman, waiting for the city bus, had been assaulted from behind and beaten with a hammer. An ill-conceived insanity defense involving messages from God did not impress the jury at Carignan's trial for attempted murder of Gwen Burton in March 1975. He was convicted and received a maximum of 40 years in prison. Since no criminal in Minnesota may be sentenced to a term exceeding 40 years, the other trials and sentences were merely window dressing.